Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Carla Kraft, and I am UN Women's Policy Specialist on Sustainable Development at our agency headquarters in New York. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today, and it is my sincere pleasure to be able to share with you some important policy dimensions that have contributed to the success of the Joint Program on Accelerating Progress towards the Economic Empowerment of Rural Women, also known as JPRWE. Dear participants, the results of the Global Learning Plan derived from the Phase 1 of the Joint Program reconfirm that irreversible progress towards sustainable development requires an enabling policy environment that guarantees rural women's rights, voice and agency, resilience, livelihoods, and economic empowerment. It is also confirmed that interagency effort around 4 comprehensive and interdependent strategies can and has resulted in lasting change for rural women. As you've heard, thus far, over 80,000 women have been directly impacted by the 4 outcome areas, which include food security, income generation, women's leadership and participation in both production and public spaces, and the deliberate promotion of gender-responsive rural development policies. In order to enable international, national, and local stakeholders to formulate evidence-based policies that effectively promote rural women's economic empowerment, both within and beyond the context of the JPRWE, 4 policy briefs are being produced aligned with the associated 4 outcome areas of the joint program. The policy briefs are using a few strategies, such as leveraging the lived experiences of the rural women in the JPRWE countries to recommend policy change that can be tailored to these countries and beyond, as well as translating lessons and best practices from the JPRWE program into comprehensive policy advice, and analyzing linkages between key normative instruments and the realized program results to identify appropriate policy solutions. The 4 topics identified were a result of a collective identification of high policy impact areas through which programmatic interventions advanced rural women's economic empowerment and sustainable development in rural areas. These topics include the first policy brief is focusing on making sustainable livelihoods for rural women. Lessons from the joint program on rural women's economic empowerment. The second one probes into why climate resilient agriculture matters for rural women's economic empowerment. The third looks at women in technology in rural areas on strengthening the adoption of both time and labor-saving technologies by rural women. And lastly, the fourth looks at making markets work for rural women, lessons from the joint program on rural women's economic empowerment. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to start giving you a bit of a context about the Sustainable Livelihoods paper. Unfortunately, with our short time together, we won't be able to have a deep dive, but we would like to give you a bit of a taste of the policy briefs and what we've been looking at and some of the outcomes and recommendations. The Sustainable Livelihoods paper identifies the interlinkages between socioeconomic well-being and environmental sustainability. In rural areas where women predominate the agricultural sector as a key source of livelihoods, women are often excluded from government and interventions aimed at promoting sustainable livelihoods. This exclusion, which means limited investment is made on rural women's capacity to promote sustainable livelihoods, is compounded by high levels of rural women's illiteracy, lack of access to finance, the disproportionate share of unpaid care and domestic work, and discriminatory social norms. In Guatemala, for example, the JPRWE identified that rural policies that promote capacity development work best for women is when they integrate solutions for addressing gender-based discrimination at its core. Such policies need the combination of both supply side solutions like literacy and financial management trainings, as well as the demand side solutions like market linkages and enhancement of rural women opportunities and access to decent work. The paper recommends strengthening rural women's participation in policy decision making at all levels and the redress of unfair competition practices in order to protect small scale rural women producers. The second paper focuses on climate resilient agriculture. Here, the JPRW identifies rural women as potential agents of environmental harmful practices, farming practices, agents of positive change, but also beneficiaries of environmental policy in the agricultural sector. These characterizations of rural women farmers frequently interact with their exclusion from climate planning, policy making, and its implementation caused by gender-based discrimination in policies and high input prices that make climate smart technologies inaccessible to them. Consequently, climate resilience benefits men more than women, even though women have historically been more involved and greatly involved in both environmental, climate action, and biodiversity protection. Policies that promote inclusion of rural women and climate resilience are instrumental not only for climate change adaptation and mitigation, but also to ensure that the benefits from climate resilient agriculture are redistributed more equitably. Furthermore, policies that promote the development of relevant rural infrastructure, like water harvesting plants, such as the case was in Rwanda, one of the implementing countries of the JPRW, and drainage canals, such was the case in Kyrgyzstan, have the potential to protect local natural resources that sustain rural forests, ecosystems, and biodiversity, while increasing rural women's economic empowerment and advancing gender equality. Finally, women's land rights and tenure security is a cornerstone at the heart of the policy work of the JPRW. And it's key to the promotion of climate resilient agriculture. One, to strengthen rural women's economic empowerment, their autonomy, their decision making over sustainable land practices. But also as a collateral for inputs for their next business adventures and for their own agency. One such example of the work that can be contributed to efforts of the JPRW was the 2018 Land Rights Act in Liberia that was passed, also with the inclusion of being a gender responsive policy. The third paper, dear participants, is an in-depth analysis of the role of technology in promoting rural women's economic empowerment. Access to, or lack thereof, technology in rural areas is linked to rural poverty and more directly to women's empowerment. It is premised on the notion that if rural women had the same access to technologies, especially agricultural technologies, as men, the gender productivity gap in agriculture could be eliminated. Technology facilitates, among other things, access to information, environmental protection, employment, and the elimination of drudgery associated with women's work, both paid and unpaid. Gender inequalities in access to, use of, and benefit from technology are a consequence of exclusion from its design and dissemination. The JPRW has collected lessons from its program countries such as Niger, where multifunctional platforms have been crucial for reducing the burden of both paid and unpaid work. Or in Liberia, where mobile money via digital platforms has allowed rural women to have more control over their finances, in turn strengthening women's economic autonomy and empowerment. The technology paper recommends how policy standards for technology uptake in rural areas should integrate both gender and sustainability considerations in technology design if technology is to support rural, gender responsive, rural sustainable development. While recognizing the prevalence of market, community level, and household power dynamics, the paper also recommends policies that target the engagement of relevant stakeholders, including men and boys, private enterprises, and custodians of traditions, to eliminate stereotypes and exclusionary practices in technology uptake, use, dissemination, and access in rural areas. The final paper looks at rural women's participation in markets, is touted for its potential to increase and secure incomes. While promoting a savings culture um, for climate resilience or for resilience in times of economic shocks, this paper identifies the power of rural women's collectives in negotiating profitable and secure market linkages with suppliers of inputs as well as buyers. Value chain analysis in the JPRWE countries demonstrates causality on women's empowerment of production, efficiency improvements, and environmental sustainability practices, including through the upgrading of traditional economic activities by reducing and redistributing women's conventional gender roles. The Markets paper recommends the promotion of policies that seeks to establish and promote gender equal and women-led cooperative production and marketing structures, relevant policy reforms, and advocacy for formal and informal economies, the latter being more common to rural areas, and the implementation of policies that advance the provision of gender-responsive financial services, savings, and credit facilities in rural areas. I would like to conclude by reiterating that a comprehensive gender responsive policy agenda at the national level is therefore advantageous when it recognizes the intersections among these seemingly standalone thematic issues. The policy recommendations offered by the JPRWE demonstrate tested approaches and lessons on systematic engagement and holistic interventions with national authorities, engagement of relevant civic voices to advocate for the promotion of gender responsive rural spaces, and the creation of necessary conditions for rural economies to respond to the specific needs of women. The participating agencies of the JPRWE will apply these solutions to the subsequent phase of the program in some of the same as well as new locations that are joining the methodological success of the program. The corresponding knowledge products will be public resources for countries as well as stakeholders, not only those directly involved in the JPRWE, but ones with significant appetite for gender responsive and sustainable rural development. I very much appreciate your attention and thank you very much. We look forward to you reading our policy briefs and our further engagement. Thank you very much.